Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jenny Martin. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Research and Innovation at the University of Wollongong, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to this special panel on antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. I'd like to begin today's proceedings with an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge that country for Aboriginal peoples is an interconnected set of ancient and sophisticated relationships. The University of Wollongong spreads across many interrelated Aboriginal countries that are bound by this sacred landscape and an intimate relationship with that landscape since creation. From Sydney to the Southern Highlands to the South Coast, from fresh water to bitter water to salt, from city to urban to rural. The University of Wollongong acknowledges the custodianship of the Aboriginal peoples of this place and space that has kept alive the relationships between all living things. The university acknowledges the devastating impact of colonisation on our campus's footprint and commit ourselves to truth-telling, healing, and education. The topic of this symposium or panel is antimicrobial resistance, which is a key focus of UOW's research. And antimicrobial resistance directly impacts the Illawarra Shoalhaven as a regional health research ecosystem. UOW works directly with the Illawarra Shoalhaven Local Health District, with New South Wales Health Pathology, with Southern IML Sonic, with regional community pharmacists, and many more influencers across the health and university sectors. It's also worth pointing out that the Illawarra Shoalhaven has a unique geography and demography, with a stable population that's really representative of the broader Australian population, making it a microcosm of Australia. And that provides many advantages to studying and addressing AMR in this region. Today is the final day of World Antimicrobial Awareness Week, which is an initiative of the World Health Organization celebrated every year from 18th to the 24th of November. The 2021 theme is Spread Awareness, Stop Resistance, and calls on health stakeholders, policymakers, healthcare providers, and the community to be antimicrobial resistance awareness champions. I'll now hand over to Senior Professor Eileen McLaughlin, Executive Dean of the Faculty of Science, Medicine and Health at the University of Wollongong, who will set the scene and introduce the panel.
Thank you, Jenny. So welcome everybody. This is your opportunity to ask our panel questions. So if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat box now, and we'll make sure that they get answered at the end of the presentations. While there's been a continuing gradual decline in community antimicrobial use up until 2019, more than 10 million people in Australia, that's 40% of the population, has had at least one antimicrobial dispensed in 2019. And this is much higher than most other developed countries. In the Illawarra, we've done great progress in making sure that antimicrobial stewardship is part of our focus. But overall in Australia, there's been a continuing gradual increase in the volume of hospital antimicrobial use, which again is much higher than our competitor nations. Altogether, there's been no real improvement in overall appropriateness of antimicrobial prescribing in Australian hospitals and aged care services. And a very high percentage of our patients continue to be prescribed antimicrobials for conditions for which there's no real evidence of benefit. These are things like bronchitis and sinusitis. The other problem that we seem to be occurring is that we have resistances to common antibiotics, and they are used for treatment of urinary tract infections and septicemia. And many of these UTIs have been linked to contamination of food products. The reports from Outbreak, which is a consortium that the university belongs to, is working to solve the growing problem of antibiotic resistance. They report that the direct cost to the Australian healthcare system of these kinds of infections through GPs, emergency departments and hospital admissions now costs the country under $1 billion a year. That's a real economic hit to the nation. In addition, we have collective antimicrobial use in companion animals and livestock in Australia, which is half therapeutic uses and non-therapeutic uses. And some of these things are actually used for growth promotion. Again, a treatment that's unauthorized in the EU and currently being phased out in North America. So we have to be aware that antimicrobial use in humans, companion animals, and also in domestic livestock is a significant source of antimicrobial resistance in the environment. And that happens through wastewater, using manure as fertilizer, and through our foodstuffs. So what are we doing to protect human health and the welfare of our animals and environment? Tonight, we have a panel of experts from across the Illawarra to share their perspectives and vision for how we can meet the ever-increasing challenges of antimicrobial resistance. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce the speakers tonight. First of all, we have Dr. Peter Jansen, who's the Executive Director of Medical Services and Clinical Governance at the Illawarra and Shoalhaven Local Health District. Associate Professor Spiros Miakas, who's the Dean of Medicine and the Head of Infectious Diseases here at Wollongong. Associate Professor Judy Mullen, who's the Academic Director of the Centre for Health Research, Illawarra and Shoalhaven Population, called CRISP for short. Dr. Chris Degelin, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Australian Centre for Health Engagement, Evidence and Values. Robert Bell, who's the co-founder and Chief Technical Officer of ProAgni, and Dr. Kay Rolls, who's a lecturer from the School of Nursing. So what I'd like to do now is throw some questions to the panel to get us started. Spiros, first off,
yes, can you hear me?
In your role as the lead infectious disease clinician at Wollongong Hospital, what do you see from day to day that suggests that antimicrobial resistance is a growing problem?
Yeah, thank you. We do see it. It's an observation that over the years, we see bacteria, the same type of bacteria being resistant to antibiotics that were not before. But according to clinical practice that should actually guide all disciplines, not only infectious diseases, we transform observations to evidence. So we collect every year, we collect the antibiograms in our hospital, same as they do in all other hospitals. And if you compare the antibiograms, the cumulative antibiograms of the bacteria of its type, Staph aureus, E. coli, etc., if you compare what we had this year or last year, let's say 10 years back, 15 years back, the difference is obvious. For the percentages for most bacteria of resistance to commonly used antibiotics is increasing, and that is across the board, as we say. And that's not only a phenomenon in Australia, it's also overseas. What is sad in Australia is that we follow that trend. We have bacteria that is called multi-resistant bacteria or pan-resistant bacteria or extremely resistant bacteria. This is nomenclature that has been adopted worldwide the last 10 years in order to exactly highlight the problem. So we need to have a common language. So we have multi-resistant bacteria, then extensively resistant bacteria, then pan-resistant bacteria. So we see the extensively resistant bacteria, pan-resistant bacteria that almost did not exist in Australia when I was trained back in, I will expose myself now, but early 2000s, well, it was not a thing in Australia. I mean, I enjoyed that. And going back to Europe and North America, it was a completely different landscape. Unfortunately, Eileen, we're catching up. Not to that degree, but we're catching up.
Thank you, Spiros. Over to Judy now. Judy, awareness of antimicrobial resistance has existed for quite a while, but the focus has been largely on the hospital setting. As a researcher in the area of health literacy and safe use of medications, and as a former pharmacist, what do you see happening in the community that might contribute to an increase in untreatable resistant infections?
Thank you, Eileen. These are several factors that contribute to this increasing untreated resistant infections in the community setting. Some of them include, not all, access to adequate medical services and medications themselves, overuse and increasing consumption of antibiotics, both in the community sector and in the hospital sector worldwide. The misuse of antibiotics, so not finishing a course of antibiotics or taking antibiotics for a viral illness rather than a bacterial infection. A lack of quick, accurate tests to diagnose the infection. So some people are started on antibiotics when they haven't even got the diagnostics back. And public perceptions about antimicrobial resistance. So influenced by the readability, understandability, and actionability of the information they have access from either their healthcare providers or from media or potentially from the internet, which a lot of them use nowadays. So often this information is pitched at a level beyond that of the health literacy capabilities of many of the consumers in the community setting. Equally, many people may not be able to understand or interpret information which is presented and focuses on clinical or epidemiological data, so they can't interpret it, so they don't understand what it means. Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you. Peter, from a local health district executive point of view, we'd like to hear your insights on the economic burden on our health systems and the risks represented by antimicrobial resistance for hospital care.
Thank you. I would have to point out first off that the impact of costs is borne by patients and families first and foremost, as well as, of course, by the health system who's going to be asked to care for people with resistant organisms. In terms of those costs, the person with a resistant infection, a bacteria or other organism that's resistant, they'll be sick for longer. They will require more intensive and more expensive healthcare and different medications. Spiros talked about the requirement, or hinted at the requirement for specialised antibiotics, and they will be more expensive. They may come with more harmful side effects and more challenging to administer. These people with these multi-resistant bacteria may also spread infections to other people, and that will multiply the costs both for people, their families, and for the health system. Within the LHD, of course, we have additional treatment pathways for those who do get infected, and a lot of programs addressing antibiotic resistance. Again, Spiros spoke about some of those things. Drilling down to some of those costs, I want to highlight things like specially trained staff, surveillance programs, reporting and feedback, microbial stewardship programs, and then there's the additional isolation rooms, personal protective equipment. We've all learned about those things during the pandemic, but they are a cornerstone of treatment for these people. There will be additional cleaning required. So you can see that there's a lot of cost for the healthcare system. In fact, these costs and the burden of illness is so high that it forms one of the Australian standards for healthcare that all hospitals have to adhere to, which brings in a whole raft of programs that we are using to improve our stewardship of antibiotics and to deal with the impact. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Over to Kay now. As a nursing researcher and having spent your career in various roles as a nurse specialist and educator and administrator, could you comment on the many great contributions our nursing staff provide to infection control and the way that we use antibiotics in the hospital setting?
Thanks, Eileen. So nurses and midwives make up 50% of the healthcare workforce. So we spend a lot of our time interacting with patients on a daily basis. And I guess the unsung heroes of infection control and infection prevention are nurses and midwives. And I remember for many, many years, there was only a team of one at Nepean Hospital, where I spent my formative years as a registered nurse who was supposed to manage that. Thankfully, over recent years, the infection prevention departments have increased greatly at most hospitals, except, of course, I don't think the resources are enough for them to impact on they've done. So I guess, in the recent years, there have been quite a number of significant programs that have reduced infections in hospital. I can think of the central line associated bacteremia study, which is the CLAB program from the CEC that ran from 2005 to 2010. That was staffed by nurses and driven by nurses. And we successfully, and before the rest of the country, managed to reduce the central line associated bacteremia in New South Wales really massively. Urinary tract infections associated with indwelling catheters are very significant and one of the most common hospital-acquired infections. And there's a massive program of work being led by Professor Brett Mitchell from the Newcastle Uni, which is focused on this fundamental component. In my teaching role with my students, I have some very simple mantras that I use to teach them about reducing infections in hospitals. And these have all come from my nursing colleagues. And one of those mantras is, if a patient has a medical device in situ, they should ask themselves, does the patient need it? If they don't, take it out. Yes, if it's functioning correctly and there's no signs of infection. If that's any answers to that, yes, take it out or replace it, or no, leave it in. So we need to consider all these basics. I guess the last component I'd like to talk about is patient education. And just to pick up on the point that Judy made about health literacy, nurses have a massive role in educating patients when they're discharged. And unfortunately, like many health professionals, we don't do this very well. So we need to capitalise on our high level of credibility in the community and take the time to educate patients on their discharge instructions, especially in relation to wound management, medications, and antibiotics. Luckily, we now have nurses and midwives in senior executive roles that are not just nurses, a nursing role or a senior midwife role, but actually in roles that they enable us to start moulding the system so that any infection control program or any microbial stewardship program actually works within the normal workflow of nurses and help us to reduce the propagation, in particular, of infections in our hospitals. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to change tack a little here. We're going to talk to Robert. Robert, the way that we as a society use antibiotics in agriculture has enormous consequences for the evolution of resistant bacteria and how they might cross into the human population. You're an expert in the agriculture centre and involved in the processes we use to feed cattle and keep these animals healthy. Can you comment really on the way that we use antibiotics in this sector and the risks and how we might be able to change that, please?
Thanks, Elaine. One of the scariest statistics that we need to be aware of is that the use of antimicrobials in the feeding sector of animals is very, very high, and about 80% of all antibiotics produced globally end up in the animal supply chain. So as a participant in that, we have a great level of responsibility and care we need to apply. We generally try to be good stewards of that chemistry, but at times the applications become more for commercial reasons and less for health reasons. So we're starting to see an increased use of antimicrobials for growth promotants. Now, part of the challenge there is when we start to talk about it, we're talking about the environment, and the farmers and the people that feed these animals become exposed to these compounds on a day-to-day basis at very low sublethal doses, which accelerates the risk and the speed of antimicrobial resistance developing. The irony of it is in agriculture, we've been quite adept at dealing with resistance. If we talk about weeds and internal and external parasites, we've developed integrated management strategies where we've been able to reduce our reliance on chemistry and develop systems and programs where we can manage these pests. But once we start to talk about the microbiome, we don't have the same level of awareness or industry stewardship that we should, in my opinion. So what we really need to focus on is how we use these compounds in the safest way. And then if we look at it from a model, we've actually got the pharmacist and the doctor being the one in the same in both production animals and companion animals. So there's a term that's regularly used in agriculture, which is about medically important antibiotics, and they're not used in agriculture. And I think that's way off the point, is that all antimicrobials are very important and they need to be respected and kept that way.
Okay, thank you, Robert. That's actually quite a scary statistic that you trotted out there. I think that speaks to how we have to look at the whole picture rather than just what's happening inside hospitals or GP surgeries. How about Chris? Your research focuses on understanding how the community perceives risks related to infectious diseases and how society responds to public health policies that are designed to curb disease. Can you comment on what type of government policies might help with the challenge and the best way that we could find to get broad acceptance of these policies?
Thanks, Eileen. So I guess its first point to make is that historically Australia has had quite a soft touch in terms of the government and regulatory responses to AMR as a problem compared to other high-income countries. That's because, as Spiros has noted, we've had a little bit of a holiday from AMR for the last 20 to 30 to 40 years because of our isolation in one dimension, but also because with some of the regulations which are introduced around some important antimicrobials not being used in agriculture, such as fluoroquinolones and fourth generation cephalosporins about 10 to 15 years ago, we haven't seen the high rates of those types of resistance in the Australian setting. And also we haven't had massive outbreaks of Clostridium difficile or other organisms which have caused hospital-based outbreaks or community-based outbreaks of MRSA, as has occurred in the US and in Europe and the UK in particular over the last 20 years. So the policy landscape in Australia has been quite consensus-driven and has been not necessarily about imposing rules and regulations, but is really, really focused on education, both of practitioners and publics. Unfortunately, in terms of public education, that hasn't worked too well so far. So Australia has probably one of the highest rates of community consumption of antibiotics in the OECD. Compared to places like the Netherlands and Sweden, the average person has twice as many antibiotics as the similar person in these countries. And we culturally accept it in a way which is quite different to other jurisdictions. So in the Netherlands, if you get a cold, it's culturally normal to try and tough it out. Whereas in Australia, most people get a cold and immediately think it's going to be bronchitis and go to the doctor if they're not better in 3 or 4 days. So there's that dimension there. And we're quite often surveyed. So in terms of public understanding, Australian population is surveyed quite regularly compared to other countries. And generally, the idea that AMR is an issue is well understood, but the actual complexity and the dimensions of it, as in what it actually means, is not very well understood generally across the Australian public. And if you look at the media and you look at the messaging that goes into it around that, usually it's quite disempowering because we're often given messages that AMR is a big problem, that doctors need to be doing something about it, that science will create solutions for us. And the public are given quite a passive role in a lot of those communications. So what really needs to change is to basically put the public in front of the problem, empower them in ways which mean that they have the capacity and the ability to do things differently to what they're currently doing, and to give them the impetus to do so. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So before we go to questions from the audience, I'd like just to go around the panel and in one sentence, what would your advice be to members of the community on how we can contribute to tackling the AMR challenge? And I might actually start with Chris, because that was what you were just talking about.
Yeah, so I think somehow or other we need to raise the importance of the issue such that people understand the stake, what's at stake. And it's catastrophizing is not very successful often because it makes it a risk that is too big to even think about. So what's happened with climate change is a lot of people have switched off because it's just too big a thing to deal with. And as an individual, you don't feel like you have much role in it. So I think we need to try and work out ways to engage publics and give them, as I just said, give them the tools and the responses and the ways to think through their engagements both with healthcare and their understandings of what it is to be healthy, to mean that antibiotics become something that is used in rare circumstances when absolutely necessary, and not something that is just assumed to be required when you're unwell.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I might go to Spiros now, because Spiros, of course, is at the pointy end, and he's the person who gets asked for antibiotics.
Yes, one advice that I give to my patients that are treated in the community, and I'm afraid that I won't have a saying or I found out too late, take this as a risk-benefit approach. We are when everybody does an operation, they would sit down and discuss with the surgeon the risk, the expected outcomes, the benefits and the risks. Why don't we take the same approach, of course, to a smaller scale, not to the extent of the discussion probably you have before you have an operation, but with a short discussion with your doctor, raise the issues. Why do I need this antibiotic? And see what they're gonna tell you. And have in mind that it has risks also. What is the benefit? Ask the benefit and have in mind that there is risks.
Okay, thank you. Peter, you obviously manage a lot of doctors. How did you get them to be careful about their antibiotic use?
Oh, that's a bit overstating my role to manage a lot of doctors. I try to influence them. I use people like Spiros and other leaders. We have regular forums during which we discuss some of the priorities. Spiros, I wouldn't think that antimicrobial resistance has yet made it into the mindset of most. So it's about us deciding that this is a priority, using research from our partners at the university, from CRISP and others, to show why it is a priority, and then working through the leadership to develop systems to improve the situation, to change what we're doing. We also have a clinical governance council, which is very interested in this because, as I said before, it makes up one of the Australian standards. And through that mechanism, we can engage with clinicians and other staff across the whole organisation.
Thank you. Going to Robert, now you have a very big constituency, the agricultural sector. How do you influence them?
I think it's a case of stopping to rely upon these compounds as a safety blanket of a just in case if something goes wrong type strategy. Really interesting case studies been the US poultry market, where about 4 years ago, only 4% of the poultry produced in the US was antibiotic free. Consumers demanded that needed to change. There's been a lot of pledges by some major leading companies around that. And they shifted to over 50% of the industry being antibiotic free in about 4 years. Now, that really shows that through implementing good management strategies, hygiene, and just having a broader scope of understanding of the total production system will allow us to reduce total antibiotic use without the sky falling in and without production economics falling apart.
Excellent, thank you. Kay, you're an educator at the front line. How do you influence your nurses and consequently the community?
I try to teach the nurses about workflow and the need to think about moving from clean areas to dirty areas. But in terms of the general public, I think we need to get across the idea that bacteria are not the enemy, that humans have lived with this complex microdome, around us for many, many years, and our friendly bacteria play a very key role in maintaining our health. We don't really understand it very well. And so we need to get that across, but we also need to tell people that they don't have to live in a sterile environment. So we have to stop getting rid of all these, antimicrobial hand washing at home. You don't need it. We need to clean for dirt, but we don't need to clear the bacteria out.
That's excellent, thank you. And Judy, what would your advice be?
My advice would be to actually understand that when antibiotics are appropriate in terms of when they need to be prescribed and when should they actually request them from their healthcare provider and the like, and especially not just in the community but in the aged care sector, it's a bit of an issue in that area as well. And also when they receive information that they can't understand and they can't action, to ensure that they speak to their healthcare provider or actually source information which they themselves understand. And for those producing the information, to be aware that cultural groups have different cultural ways of actually dealing with things. As Chris said earlier, in the Netherlands, they think, oh, well, you'll man up and we won't go and ask for an antibiotic. And maybe having more of that sort of sense of, dealing with it in that way would be a good way forward in the future.
Brilliant, thank you. So what we might do now is move to some questions which have been submitted by the audience, some of which were in advance. And touching on what Judy's just talked about, I'd like to go to Peter and just say, equity and access to antibiotics How can we manage this in at-risk populations or underrepresented populations?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really challenging question. So before I came to Wollongong, I was practicing in New Zealand. And the same thing occurs in New Zealand as occurs in Australia. We have, for example, an epidemic of rheumatic fever amongst Indigenous populations, which, because the Indigenous populations are much smaller, doesn't really register very highly. Nevertheless, there's underprescribing of antibiotics in those populations, resulting in the epidemic of rheumatic fever. So we've got to be more nuanced in what we do. It's not a matter of saying no antibiotics for any respiratory infection. It's about taking into account the person's circumstances, the risk of unwanted effects from not prescribing, as well as the unwanted effects from prescribing. It is challenging, but we've got to give the full message to all of our prescribers, not just the simple message.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So this is a question for Robert. Should we actually regulate against using antibiotics worldwide in the agriculture industry?
I think prophylactic use in agriculture is a practice that needs to be addressed very seriously. It basically is not needed when management systems match what we're trying to achieve. So I think there's other ways around it.
Okay, so question now for Spiros, because this will be very topical. Spiros, there is concern that COVID-19 could become resistant to hand sanitizers. Do you want to comment?
No, yeah, it won't. It won't. The dynamics and the structure of itself as a virus will not make it easily to become resistant to hand sanitizers. So there the things are simple, but unlike the viruses, unlike COVID-19, the bacteria that have more structures and more explicit mechanisms, have DNA to develop resistance, the bacteria can become resistant to sanitizers. And we have seen that happen into local antibiotics when those are used without a plan. I think there needs to be plan on antibiotic usage. There has been actually New Zealand, Peter mentioned New Zealand before. Deborah Williamson, as you know, when she was in New Zealand before coming to Melbourne, they led an excellent study there showing even clones of Staph aureus becoming resistant after local mupirocin use, which is a local antibiotic, when it is used undiscriminatively, when probably not needed, and without a comprehensive plan. Usually the plans, same as all plans in life, not only for treating antibiotics, need a coordinated approach to know your plan A, your plan B. Just throw antibiotics without really having planned. It does not work. So, and this leads me to the last thing I want to touch in this, education. Leading the antimicrobial stewardship program in ISLIT for almost 10 years now, I keep saying to my collaborators and also to whoever asks me this question, that if I ditch out the components of the antimicrobial stewardship program, I regard education of our peers as the most important. I think Peter and the others have mentioned that before. It's utmost importance to educate our junior doctors and the doctors who are specialists in other fields. So everybody's, specialized to something, and we happen to be specialized in infectious disease law, a little bit how this works. We need to give to other people a little bit of what we learn over the years and try to guide them with how to educate the antibiotics. How to use the antibiotics. I see, for example, a question in the chat, if you allow me, Eileen, should we be stepping away from prophylactic antibiotics? Well, sometimes prophylactic antibiotics are necessary, for example, in some operation, but you need to know when to give it and when not to give it, and when to stop. One dose is all is needed. Unfortunately, still our senior doctors, a lot of our senior doctors start and they don't stop unless we come and tell them to stop. So education is needed.
Okay, thank you very much. I can see that you've got a big task ahead of you. I like to go to to Judy now. And can you give some examples of antimicrobial resistance that actually happen in ordinary people's daily life?
Well, I guess the doctors are probably a better place to actually answer that question than myself. But I mean, there are some people who, you know, in my experience in the hospital, and I'd like Spiros to comment on this, where they went in for, you know, simple procedures on their knees and the like, and they came out with MRSA and they had all different types of infections, and they're just simple infections and simple procedures they went in for, but came out with resistances. So I'd really appreciate Spiros's input here, or Peter's as well.
You gave an excellent example. Somebody comes in for a small minor procedure, then we'll have another 3 or 4 hospitalizations for multi-resistant bacteria. And the other thing that the other classically bad example is the Clostridium difficile that I think Robert mentioned that before, the Clostridium difficile, which is multi-resistant by itself, and it is the example often of use of antibiotics, which sometimes is required. The antibiotics are required, but unfortunately, according to Murphy's law, most of the times of the C. diff that we see is not required, where antibiotics behind that were not required, and people end up having bad diarrheas, which often even can lead to colectomy. Not only lose their life, which is the worst, and we have seen that. I've seen a couple of those in my career so far, but even colectomies. And what's the worst thing? I mean, from a course of antibiotic, ending losing up your bowel and end up with a stomach.
The other example I would give, which has been mentioned before, I think Kay, you mentioned, was around urosepsis. So inappropriate use for urinary tract infections leading to resistant organisms, and then unfortunately a vulnerable person gets a very bad infection in the urinary system and ends up in hospital for a long time.
And one of the other ones that I've actually sort of come up with when I worked in the hospital and home was community-acquired pneumonias. Sometimes they were sort of developed resistances to different pneumonias.
It's pretty common. So I might go with one other question from the audience that was submitted earlier. Chris, do you think that the Australian government is dedicating enough resources and taking the issue seriously enough?
Or being funded indirectly by the Australian government, I still have to say probably not. Certainly there's an element to which basic science is being funded, and then there's also health service research, and a lot of social science research is starting to be funded on this issue. But if you compare the amount of funding and the way it's organised to places which have really leapt on board and taken this as a major issue, such as the UK, then they're in a completely different league in terms of the amount of resources that are being poured into dealing with this issue. And I think that also then again comes down to our experience. So the Australian public have not had a lot of AMR in their lives or experience of, whereas average person in the UK probably knows someone who's had very bad experiences with AMR from a variety of reasons. But we have the opportunity in Australia to learn from overseas, but we also have the opportunity to invest in Australia in researchers such as Antoine and, dare I say, everyone on this panel to try and put us ahead of the game rather than always catching up.
That's great. I concur with you. Coming from Europe, I saw several of my relatives be hospitalized for resistant infections, and it was very devastating for the families concerned. One other question that's come out, and this is back to Robert. How much antibiotic use in animal agriculture contributes to the overall problem compared to misuse or overuse in the healthcare sector? Do you think it's a significant impact?
I do, and it's generally from the prophylactic use and the such low doses over such a long period of time. If we take an animal in a feeding program, they can be anywhere from 60 to 400 days intensively fed in the beef sector, or a dairy cow's 365 days of the year. They're fed repeated doses on a daily ration of subtherapeutic antibiotic compounds, which it's the perfect scenario for developing resistance. We also have, they're not currently on the market, but I believe they're trying to get back to the market of interruminal boluses. So capsules that are contained a slow release level of ionophoric compounds to promote growth and mitigate some animal health issues, but then they're not at a therapeutic dose. They're a 110, 120 day payout. So, you know, we contribute very heavily, I believe, to the environment for, you know, the replication and the opportunity for these bacteria and these bugs to actually generate the RNA and the DNA codes to survive the pressure that we're trying to put on them. So we have a huge level of responsibility. And, you know, I've come from the place where I've made the recommendations and used those compounds professionally in my career. And once I started to understand the actual risks that we're running, we had to create change. So that's, you know, that's what we're trying to do. It's a huge problem. And education's been a common theme by most people. And the farming sector who use, you know, these compounds don't actually know they're using them a lot of the time. And it will be driven by a consumer. And we're starting to see that in Europe and the US markets now, where some drugs are being withdrawn from animal use because they are becoming medically important. And, you know, there was a letter sent yesterday by 126 clinicians to McDonald's to improve their game because they've pledged to reduce antibiotic use by December this year, and they've made no changes. So, you know, the awareness is rising. It's rising fast, but we need to be on the front foot. You know, I'm passionate about agriculture and the environment and the communities I work with, but we need to take responsibility and stewardship on a more forward step.
So do you think that if we labelled our food, packaging on our food, that animals were antibiotic free, would that help? Or do you think that would change?
I think that's a challenge, and we do see that in the markets now, especially in the chicken and white meat sector, so pig and pork, where there's 3 tiers of those sort of organic, antibiotic free and conventional. The beef and the lamb sector, the red meat sector is a little bit more challenging, basically because of the legislation. Some of the compounds are technically classed as antibiotics in other countries, but not in Australia. So these ionophoric compounds are not needing to be labelled around that space. So that's one of the challenges I can see that we need to address.
Thank you. So going off on a different tack, Spiros, do you have any views on cascade antibiotic reporting from pathology laboratories?
Yes, you mean the concealed, the ones that they do not show all the antibiotics available to clinicians. That's actually one thing that we do often in the lab, and that's targeted because this one targets the clinician to use a simpler antibiotic than the one they probably are using, or the one that could use but would have much broader spectrum. That is actually a very good tactic, and I welcome the phone calls that we get in antimicrobial stewardship. For those in the audience who don't know what I mean with antimicrobial stewardship and how much time it takes, we have one of our consultants in the hospital 24/7 on call for antibiotic advice. So every doctor can pick up the phone and say, and from the community, and I'll come to that in a moment, and say, ask a question about antibiotic use. So one of the most welcome questions, Eileen, is, this E. coli is sensitive to ampicillin or amoxicillin, and I can't find meropenem. They're using meropenem when I can't find tazocin. What's happening? That's exactly what is needed, because it gives an opportunity, as I said before, for education, to explain that this is all is needed. And actually, even if you had the patient on something broader, which we sometimes do, and sometimes it's appropriate, but you need to de-escalate early. I mentioned a plan before. So it's not always bad, especially when somebody comes with sepsis, with severe infection, and they have been treated with antibiotic, to hit hard and hit early, as we say in infectious disease, and use a broad spectrum. But you need to have a plan and de-escalate early as soon as you have your data. Actually, there is good evidence that shows that antimicrobial resistance in humans is probably not done by one dose of this meropenem, I said before, or one dose of vancomycin. Is done by leaving 15 days the cefazolin or the Keflex without really being needed, because that offers the constant pressure to the remaining flora to develop these resistant clones. So from that point of view, that is one of the bundles of measures, as we call them, to sort of offer education prevent undifferentiated and unplanned properly use of antibiotics, and it helps. Same as all the other measures that that I mentioned before. One thing that I'm not sure if it will come up, stop me if it will come up or you had it in mind, but I want to address, because it's one of my needs as doctor practicing in hospital, is for the antimicrobial stewardship, our government to expand the antimicrobial stewardship efforts in the community. Actually, you see the hospital use of antibiotics, it's only a small cluster to what's happening in the community in the GP space. And it is an immediate need and a very big need that we reach out to the community and we offer a comprehensive antimicrobial stewardship along with education that it offers program. And us, Antoine that is here in the panel, and Judy and myself and Peter Newton have in the past reached out to our hospital, to our community pharmacists, and the next step is to reach out to our community GPs in the WARA Alliance to try to offer education. But this is actually one drop, probably one drop in the barrel. We need a comprehensive reach out for community antimicrobial stewardship. And I say that loudly and emphatically. And please, whoever can influence people, please join your forces.
Thank you very much. So on that, there's another question from the audience. And for Chris, what sort of public awareness campaigns have actually worked, have been successful in places like the UK and Sweden?
They're actually very difficult to evaluate. So the UK has had, as you probably know, Eileen, there's been several public awareness campaigns which have been run using a variety of forums, from theatre through to mass kind of online events, through to school books and courses taught to primary school students, through to bus billboards and a whole range of things. And none of them really have the sustained impact that you would hope that they do. And that's because, to a large extent, we're not necessarily changing enough in terms of the structures which antibiotics are used to support. So it's all very well to focus on behaviour and try and get people to behave differently, but unless you actually change the structure or the choices which they have, then it actually is not necessarily going to be very effective. So the answer is there's no magic bullet in terms of public awareness. I think the examples of the Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands in particular, and Sweden actually in particular, where there hasn't necessarily been a focus on public education, and that the sort of chicken and the egg there, because culturally they're less inclined to think that they need antibiotics, and therefore there's less demand, so therefore there's less need for public education. But those are places where there's also been a lot of practice level policy and regulatory action. So there are things like penalties for doctors who are found to overprescribe. There are rewards for doctors who are found to prescribe appropriately, which are things which we have never countenanced doing in Australia. And it's a little bit, I think, putting the onus on the public to be aware is important, but it's also, I think, important that those people who hold the script pads are also part of the conversation. And if they're not responding appropriately, then we should also focus on them. Because if the community use of antibiotics in Australia ultimately is being written, the scripts are being written by doctors. So
it sounds, Chris, like the same kind of frictions in the right places that are useful in all other spheres of life. It's a behavioral economics approach. If you don't want something to happen, a behavior to happen, put the friction in the right place so that people are redirected to the right place.
So going from that, there's a question that says, what's the best option if you don't want people to use antibiotics?
Who are you asking? All of us?
I was going to say all three of you could answer that one.
To educate. I live in education. Probably I'm a little bit biased as a university teacher, but really I'm seeing that in the hospital.
I would like my nursing colleagues to answer, because my nursing colleagues are far better at following evidence-based guidelines than my medical colleagues, sorry to say, Professor Nasser, but what can you tell me?
Kate?
Oh, it's one out of left field. I think because I spend a lot of my time looking at evidence-based behaviours and why people don't follow behaviours. I'd just like to push back on Spiros and his idea of education. I think it's about influence, and it's about influencing the right people to do the right thing and having conversations about it. I think our GPs are enormously busy people. Certainly it's very difficult to get in with them, and trying to get them in front of those conversations. So if we could get them having the conversations and getting them influenced by credible people, whoever those credible people are, I think that can change our behaviours. I think the DNA of the nurse is to follow orders, for want of a better word, and orders are, whatever is assigned to us, and where it's drilled into us for many years to follow the policy, because otherwise, you're going to get into trouble. And I think the independent nature of the doctor, which we should never, ever take away, means that it's very difficult to influence them back. So perhaps we need to start with the, as soon as they enter medical school, and start working on them, make sure that antimicrobial resistance is high on the agenda, and also infection prevention.
That's great. So along those lines, what would you say to the widespread use of hand sanitizers, and how we can start to re-educate people about those?
I don't know. The very beginning of COVID and the uptake in antimicrobial sanitizers, I was very concerned about the impact that would have on behaviours and the local biodome or whatever is in a hospital. And I'm not sure how we're going to be able to stop that. I think there'll be a reduction in supply. But again, perhaps we need some influence campaigns going on television, and to suggest that the widespread use of hand sanitizers, or perhaps a story on Home and Away about the terrible risks of antimicrobial infections. We might be able to influence them to run a storyline, I don't know, on antimicrobial resistance. Get it into the popular media.
So this is a slightly left field question, and it's for Jenny, because I know that Jenny works in this area of research. What would happen if we came to antimicrobials? What would the world look like? Is there any medications being researched to replace antibiotics?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question. Gosh, look, I want to go back a bit and just say that pharmaceutical companies, by and large, have abandoned antibiotic research because we've found all the low-hanging fruit, and because there's not much incentive for pharmaceutical companies to invest in difficult-to-find drugs where there's very little financial return to the company, because these antibiotics are only taken for short periods of time, not for the rest of your life. So they tend to not invest in antibiotic research. However, there are a bunch of people around the world trying to look at different ways of coming up with new antibiotics, and maybe even just modifying current antibiotics or using them in combinations in different ways. And then there's a bunch of people working on new ways of treating infection instead of by killing bacteria, which is what antibiotics do. They either kill them or stop them from growing. And bacteria obviously don't want to die and stop growing, so they develop resistance very quickly. So there's a new approach targeting virulence, which is the way that bacteria cause disease is by producing these little molecular weapons that cause the symptoms that we experience. And these molecular weapons are called virulence factors. So there is a new approach to develop anti-virulence mechanisms, drugs that target these virulence factors without killing bacteria, which means theoretically we may be able to overcome resistance in time, or we may be able to also use these anti-virulence drugs without impacting on the natural microbiome. So there's a bunch of positive impact of developing antivirulence drugs, but they are as yet not available in the clinic. They're very early stage design, but certainly there's a lot of people working in universities around the world to tackle antibiotic resistance. As I said, by and large, pharmaceutical companies have exited this process because it's so difficult. Does that answer the question, Eileen?
I think it does. It says that there are alternative modes to what we actually have available just now, but they're not available off the shelf. It's going to be a while for that technology to come in. The one question that's in, there are some certain substances that we commonly use. Sometimes we use them in things like cosmetics, and sometimes we use them in things like labs, without knowing that they can cause antibiotic resistance. Does anybody have any idea of what the public is actually doing about this, or government is doing about this? Judy?
I don't know an awful lot about that at all, to be honest. So it's not my area of expertise, so I can't really comment, but I do know that oftentimes there are products, as Robert pointed out, where people are totally unaware of the fact that there are antibiotics included in the products. And so it might be a way of identifying these products that do have the antibiotics within them. So I'm sorry, I don't really know the answer to that question, and I'm happy for anybody else to jump in if they know more.
Is there environmental exposures that you know about that are causing antimicrobial resistance? Not sure.
I might just jump in from an ag perspective.
Yeah.
There's been a recent ban of the use of copper sulfate for treating winged pigs in Europe because of its ability to induce antibiotic resistance. So it's
also higher levels of iron in water, in wastewater, can drive resistance in organisms in wastewater as well. So there's chemical dimensions to this. So industrial estates are places where they find unusual resistance profiles in bacteria.
And another example is the antifungal resistance. The antifungal resistance, which is a problem, we see more and more resistance in fungi, is largely driven by pesticides and by agents that are used in agricultures without necessarily, it doesn't work the same. Like in humans, you can develop resistance while you are treated, but the funguses are resistant de novo before, and that happens unfortunately in the environment, unlike in humans. It's a complex. That's a great point, Eileen. Just to show that how much it's a whole ecosystem, and the resistance develops in all those aspects and in all of these little coins and the little details of the ecosystem. And that's why it's difficult to tackle, because it needs, I'll say that once more, a comprehensive bundle of care. Even if you focus in one area and leave the other areas unaddressed or incompletely addressed, I don't think much will be achieved.
Okay, well, so with that, we've got to the end of the questions that have been posted, and we're almost out of time. So I'd just like to wrap up, first of all, by thanking Jenny and Robert and Peter, Spiros, Judy, Kay, and Chris. And in the background, Antoine, Emily, and Skye, who have actually been helping us do this. So thank you very much to everybody who's actually present. And I'd just like to say, leave you with a couple of thoughts about antimicrobial resistance. We've actually seen a dramatic reduction in antimicrobial dispensing in Australia throughout 2020 because of the COVID pandemic. So we weren't obviously getting quite as many colds and flus as we were before. And this may be an opportunity to target inappropriate antibiotic use in the community and sustain this lower volume in the future. So it's something that we may be able to do. But one of the things that Judy and Antoine and the teams around the Illawarra have been doing is they've been developing smart prescribing, which is based off of a huge amount of data that we get from our very stable population in the Illawarra, and that's off the CRIS database. And we know that adjacent postcodes have differing resistances. And so GPs can actually check which are the best antibiotics for their patients by looking at this database. And therefore, we're diversifying the amount of antimicrobials that are actually in the environment. So they get the best chance of being treated successfully if they do need to actually have antibiotics. And this is within the existing prescribing frameworks for GPs. So it doesn't actually cause any additional risk to the patients, but it does mean that our chances of developing resistant disease and to successfully treating the patients has actually come on quite a lot. So I'd like to say thank you very much to Judy and Spiros and the rest of the teams who have actually taken part in this. I think it's a really good development for the Illawarra, and we could, if we can get this to work successfully over a longer time period, be able to roll this out across the country. So thank you very much, team, for all of your stewardship in antimicrobial use. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. Hope that you found this really useful, and look forward to seeing you next year in the Antimicrobial Week. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.